Janis Joplin had a theory about music. She'd had it for years, long before anyone knew her name, back when she was singing in bars in Austin and Port Arthur to audiences who talked through her sets and tipped badly. The theory was simple. The guitar was a machine. A beautiful machine, yes. A machine that could make your chest ache if the right person was playing it. But still a machine. The voice was different. The voice came from somewhere the fingers couldn't reach. The voice had blood in it. The voice had memory. You could tune a guitar. You couldn't tune what a human being had lived through. She believed this the way some people believe in gravity, not as an opinion, as a fact. And in the summer of 1967, at the peak of everything, backstage at a venue in San Francisco, where the walls still smelled like the previous night's smoke, she said it out loud. She didn't mean it as a challenge. That was the thing nobody who retold the story later ever quite got right. Janis Joplin was not a cruel person. She was a loud one and a fearless one, and sometimes those qualities got mistaken for cruelty. But what she said that night, she said the way she said most things, directly, without ceremony, because the thought was in her head and her mouth had no patience for waiting. Jimi Hendrix was sitting across the room when she said it. The room was small. Most backstage rooms in 1967 were small. This one had a folding table along one wall, a mirror with bulbs that had started burning out and nobody had replaced, a couch that had survived at least one decade it had no business surviving, and maybe a dozen people scattered across it with varying degrees of interest in being there. Roadies, a manager whose name Janis could never remember. Two photographers who had followed Janis in and were now pretending they'd been invited. Someone's girlfriend, a journalist from a magazine Janis didn't read, and Jimi. He was in the corner nearest the door, the way he usually was in rooms like this. Not hiding exactly, just positioned near the exit the way certain people always are. People who've learned to read when an evening is about to go sideways. He had a cigarette going and a drink he wasn't finishing. His guitar was in a case on the floor beside him, which was unusual. Most nights the guitar was already out. Most nights Jimmy's hands needed something to do. That night the case was closed. Janis had known Jimi for almost a year at that point. They'd met at Monterey in June, two people thrown into the same impossible week, both of them aware they were standing at a door that was about to open and terrified in different ways about what was on the other side. Monterey had been the kind of event that changes the shape of a career. Janis had walked out there and torn herself open in front of 50,000 people and walked off knowing she would never be unknown again. Jimi had done the same thing with a Stratocaster and a can of lighter fluid. After his set at Monterey, Janis had stood backstage and not said anything for a long time. That was unusual for her. She'd watched him from the wings and then gone to her own dressing room and sat in front of the mirror for a while. She was not a woman who found it easy to locate language for things that genuinely stopped her. The easy things she talked about endlessly. The things that actually reached her went quiet. By September 1967, they had crossed paths enough times that the early strangeness of Monterey had settled into something more ordinary. They were not close, but there is a kind of familiarity that musicians have with each other that has nothing to do with friendship. A recognition that happens in the first few notes when someone plays near you, and you hear immediately whether they understand what you understand. Janis and Jimi had that, but that night in San Francisco, something was off between them. Not hostile, just slightly misaligned in the way that two people can be when one of them has been carrying something and hasn't yet decided whether to put it down. The evening had started as those evenings always started, gradually and then all at once. Jimi had been quiet since he arrived, quieter than usual, which was saying something because Jimi was generally not loud in rooms. On stage, he was a force of nature. Off stage, he had a stillness that could unsettle people who didn't know him, and that Janis had come to recognize as his natural state. She was not in a quiet mood. She had just come off stage herself, still running hot from the performance, still feeling that particular electricity that lived in her body for an hour or two after a good set. She'd been talking since she walked in, about the show, about a promoter who'd shorted them on the sound check, about a song she was trying to finish that kept collapsing at the bridge. She talked the way she sang, with her whole body committed to it, nothing held in reserve. At some point, the conversation turned to instruments. It often did in rooms like this. Specifically, it turned to the question of whether a guitar could say something a voice couldn't. One of the photographers had made a comment, something about how guitar solos communicated emotions that were too complex for lyrics. An observation, not a provocation. But it landed on Janis in a way that activated something. She had thoughts on this subject. She said them. The guitar, she argued, was precise in the way machines were precise. You could control it. You could decide exactly what pitch, what duration, what pressure. You were always the one making the choice, but the voice came from a place you didn't fully own. When it cracked for real. When it gave out for real. The voice couldn't be tuned back to perfect after a bad night. The voice carried the whole history of the person it lived inside, whether that person wanted it to or not. The guitar was an instrument. The voice was a confession. She said something close to this, maybe more elegantly, maybe less. She'd had a few drinks, and the thoughts were coming faster than the language. Then she said the part that nobody in that room forgot. She said, "The guitar doesn't bleed." It landed differently than she'd intended. She felt it the moment it left her mouth, felt the slight change in the air, felt several people in the room do the thing people do when they're trying not to look somewhere, which made everyone look. Jimmy had not moved. He was still in the corner by the door, cigarette in hand, drink on the floor beside him, guitar case at his feet. His expression had not changed in any way Janis could read. He was looking at her, not hard, not with anything that resembled anger, just looking, the way Jimmy sometimes looked at things, with that quality of attention he had that could feel, depending on your mood. Either like being understood or like being studied. He didn't say anything. The room waited. Someone else started talking, filling the silence the way people do when silence becomes uncomfortable. And the moment passed, or appeared to pass, and the evening moved forward in the direction evenings move. But Janis felt it, the things she'd said sitting in the room with them. She didn't take it back. That wasn't who she was, but she felt it. An hour later, Jimmy picked up his guitar. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't ask for quiet. He just opened the case, took out the Stratocaster, and sat back down with it in his lap. People noticed, the way people in a room always noticed when Jimmy had a guitar in his hands, but nobody said anything. The conversations around the room continued at lower volumes, organically, without anyone deciding to lower them. He started to tune. This took a while. Jimmy tuned by ear, always, and he was particular about it in a way that other guitarists weren't. He would play a string, listen, adjust, play it again, listen differently, adjust again. It was painstaking and slow, and there was something about watching it that Janis found she couldn't look away from. The precision of it, the patience, the absolute refusal to move forward until the thing was right. She thought about what she'd said. She thought about the word machine. He wasn't playing yet, and already it felt like something was happening. When he started, it was quiet. That was the first thing. No amp or an amp turned down to almost nothing, so that the sound that came out was close to acoustic, close to the raw sound of strings and wood, the guitar speaking in its own voice before anything was added to it. In 1967, people were not used to hearing Jimi Hendrix quietly. He was a loud musician, a musician of extremes, of feedback and sustain, and the full voltage of everything he could get out of an amplifier. Hearing him like this, stripped down, was like hearing a river and then seeing where the water started. He played a few notes without shape, finding something, the way a person finds their way across a dark room, not by looking, but by touch. Then he started singing. Most people, even people who loved Jimi Hendrix, did not think of him primarily as a singer. This was a mistake they made because the guitar was so overwhelming that everything else got pulled into its orbit. But Jimmy had a voice. He had always had a voice. And that night in San Francisco, in that small room with the burned-out bulbs and the too many people, he let it come forward in a way he rarely did in public. He sang like he was telling someone something he'd been waiting to say for a long time. The song was not one anyone in the room recognized. It might have been something he was writing. It might have been something he was inventing as he went, the words arriving the same way the notes did, out of some interior logic that was his alone. The lyrics, what Janis could follow of them, were about distance, about the space between people, about the thing that persists in that space when everything else has been said and silence is all that's left. He sang it like the guitar was answering him, like there were two voices in the room having a conversation, and he was both of them. The room had gone completely still. Janis had not moved. She was aware of not moving. She was aware of the glass in her hand that she'd forgotten she was holding. She was aware of the sound of her own breathing and how strange it seemed that she was still breathing, that the room still had air in it, that the ordinary mechanics of being alive were still operating when what was happening in the corner by the door was so far outside the ordinary that it seemed to require different rules entirely. The guitar bled. She didn't think this in words. It arrived in her body before language got to it, the way the best things always did. Jimmy played for maybe 6 minutes. He didn't build to anything. He didn't climax and resolve. He let the song find its own ending the way water finds its own level. And then he was done, and the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than it needed to, everyone waiting to be sure. Then someone exhaled. Then someone said something quiet and private to the person next to them. Then the room gradually reassembled itself, the conversations restarting, the normal volume returning, but nothing quite the same as it had been before. These things leave marks on rooms, on people. Janis put her glass down. She did not say anything to Jimmy that night. Not about the song, not about what she'd said earlier. She talked to other people. She laughed at things. She stayed another hour and then left the way she always left. Fast and complete. No long goodbyes, just gone. Jimmy watched her go. He didn't call after her. He didn't say anything. He just watched, the guitar still in his lap. And then he looked back down at the strings, and his fingers found something quiet to play. Nobody who was in that room that night talked about it publicly for a long time. The story existed in the way certain stories exist in small circles. Known to the people who were there, retold among themselves, held privately, not because it was shameful, but because some things feel too specific to survive translation. What Janis said that night, after she left the room, she said to her bassist. He remembered it for the rest of his life. She said, "I told him the guitar doesn't bleed." He asked what happened. She didn't answer for a long time. They were walking to the car. The street was empty except for them and the sound of the city going on without them in the middle distance. Then she said, "I was wrong about that." He asked if she'd told Jimmy. She shook her head, lit a cigarette, kept walking. She never told Jimmy. There were other nights in other cities after San Francisco, the way there always were in 1967 and 1968 and 1969. The years that accumulated so quickly nobody who was living through them had time to understand what they were. She and Jimmy crossed paths in the usual ways. They were friendly in the way they had always been friendly. The guitar she'd dismissed, she listened to differently after that night. Heard things in it she hadn't been willing to hear before, but she didn't tell him. She had the words for it, eventually. She just didn't say them. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970. He was 27 years old. Janis Joplin died on October 4, 1970. She was 27 years old. There were 17 days between them. 17 days in which Janis knew about Jimmy, and the world did not yet know about Janis. And what happened inside her during those 17 days is one of the things about her that will never be fully known because she didn't write it down, and she didn't say it to anyone who later wrote it down. Only the outline remains, that she was quieter than usual, that she canceled 2 interviews without explanation, that she was working on a song she never finished. The journalist who'd been in the room in San Francisco that night published a piece about Jimmy in 1975, 5 years after both of them were gone. It was a long piece, personal, about the musicians he'd known and watched, and what they'd taught him about music and about something harder to name than music. He wrote one paragraph about that night. He didn't use Janis's name. He referred to her only as another musician, a woman who had been in the room. He described what Jimmy played. He described the silence that followed. He described the woman standing very still with a glass in her hand. He wrote that she had made a comment earlier in the evening about the guitar being a machine, and that after Jimmy played, she hadn't said anything at all. He wrote, "I don't know what she was thinking, But I know what I was thinking. I was thinking that what I just heard was the sound of someone proving something without meaning to prove it, without trying to prove it. That's the only kind of proof that counts in the end. The kind you don't reach for. The kind that just arrives. He didn't know about the conversation in the parking lot. He didn't know what Janis had said to her bassist on the way to the car. That came out later from the bassist himself in an interview he gave in 1983, when someone asked him about Janis and Jimmy and what it had been like to be close to both of them in those years. He said she'd told him she was wrong. He said she never explained exactly what she meant, but he knew. He said, Janis knew better than most people that a voice could hide things, could perform things, could make you think it was giving you everything when it was really giving you a very skilled version of everything. Jimmy's guitar didn't do that. When he played, there was nothing between you and whatever it was he was trying to say. That's what bleeding means, I think. That's what she heard that night, that there was no distance in it. The guitar doesn't bleed. She was wrong about that, and she knew it, and she never said it to the person who showed her. That's the part of the story that doesn't resolve. The part that sits with you after, the part that has no redemption arc, no completed conversation, no moment where the two people in the room find the language for what passed between them and speak it out loud, and the record is set straight. Sometimes there's no time. Sometimes you think there's going to be more time and there isn't, and the thing you meant to say stays unsaid, and all that remains is the 17 days between September 18th and October 4th, and the unfinished song, and the canceled interviews, and the small quiet fact of a woman who heard something one night that changed the way she understood something she'd believed her whole life, and who never found the words to tell the person who changed it. Jimi Hendrix sat in a corner by the door with his guitar and let the music speak for him. It usually did.